Good afternoon, everyone. We are so happy to have you here. Welcome to the Interagency Digital Equity Grant Information Session. My name is Maggie Woods, and I'm a Digital Equity Manager with the Office of Digital Equity and Literacy. And just to orient you of who we are in terms of state government, so we are a part of the Department of Information Technology in the Division of Broadband and Digital Equity. So our sister office, the Broadband Infrastructure Office, is focused on getting broadband infrastructure to every household, every business across North Carolina. You may have heard of some of their very large grant programs like the GREAT Grant Program. Our office, the Office of Digital Equity and Literacy, is working on all of those other elements of the digital divide, which we'll talk through in just a moment. So moving on to the next slide, I want to give you a sense of what our agenda is for today. So we're going to start with just some definitions so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about when we say digital equity. And then we'll talk about the grant and the grant requirements. So you'll hear me speak today for about 15 or 20 minutes, but what I'm really hoping is that we can have a robust Q&A discussion session. We've done one other info session, and it was a really strong discussion session that we could really learn from each other. So hoping we can do that. If you have a question, you're welcome to put it in the chat any moment. We will get to those chat questions at the end. At the end, we'll also have the opportunity for you to raise your hand and unmute yourself if you'd prefer to ask your question that way. So lots of ways for you to interact and ask questions. And since we always do get this question, I do want to let you know that this is being recorded and it will be online so that you can access it. As will the recordings of the other info sessions. And then these slides will also be online for you to access them in the future. So let's get started. So moving on to the next slide, talking about definitions. So when we mean digital equity, we mean all individuals and communities have the information technology capacity needed for full participation in our society, democracy, and economy. Digital equity is necessary for civic and cultural participation, employment, lifelong learning, and access to essential services. So digital equity is the goal. It's the goal of our entire division. It's what we're working towards every single day. The way we get there is through digital inclusion. So digital inclusion are the activities, the policies we put into place to get to digital equity. And digital inclusion tends to have 5 main elements. And these are the main elements that we're focused on in this grant program. So the first is access to affordable high-speed internet. Let me start over. The first is access to affordable high-speed internet. And the key word here is affordable, because you may have access to the internet, but if you can't afford it, you're not able to use it, you're not able to get the economic benefits that the internet has to offer. The second is access to a device that meets the needs of a user. So typically we mean a computer, laptop, sometimes a tablet. We typically do not mean a smartphone. And the reason we don't mean a smartphone is that it's really hard to do your homework on a smartphone. It's really hard to do your work on a smartphone. Smartphones also often have data plans that are very expensive if you go over those data plans. So if you're using a smartphone as your only form of internet, it's typically not advised. It can get very expensive very quickly. In some populations, in some situations, smartphones might be the way to go, but we typically mean a computer, laptop, or sometimes a tablet. So the third aspect of digital inclusion is access to digital literacy training. Do you know how to use that computer? Do you know how to use the internet? And of course, digital literacy is a spectrum, right? There's really basic digital literacy, which is extremely important. Do you know how to turn on your computer? Do you know how to get onto the internet? Can you send an email? Those sorts of basic skills. But when we think about how does digital literacy and digital skills move you up that workforce development ladder, that's where we start thinking about, well, what other skills might you need? Can you use Excel? Excel appropriately? Do you know how to use different database software? Do you know how to code? So we are all somewhere along that digital literacy spectrum, and thinking about how we build individual digital skills is really important here. The fourth aspect is having quality technical support. Do you know where to go if your computer breaks? Or something doesn't work well with your internet? Do you have a place that you can go, someone you can call in order to get really good technical assistance, technical support? And finally, from kind of a macro level, we need to be thinking about how applications and online content are designed to enable and encourage self-sufficiency, participation, and collaboration, particularly with those who may have a disability or those who do not speak English. So how do we make online content more accessible? So those are the basic definitions of digital equity, digital inclusion. So let's move on to the next slide so that we can talk through where the funding for this grant program comes from. And this is more so that you know where these funds come from. So these funds are from the American Rescue Plan Act. And in the most recent budget back in November 2021, we were allocated almost $1 billion to advance broadband infrastructure and digital equity. Most of that funding is going through our sister office, the Broadband Infrastructure Office, to support infrastructure build out across the state. And you can see the various programs that they're working on, some that have been rolled out like the GREAT program, and some that are coming down the line like CAB and stopgap solutions. But we also received the largest investment in digital literacy that we've ever seen in the state, and that's $50 million. So this first $10 million worth of funding is coming from that $50 million of American Rescue Plan Act funds. So moving on to the next slide, I want to give an overview of this grant program and what's coming now and what's coming in the future. So this fall, this is why you're all here today, we've launched the Interagency Digital Equity Funding Program. We expect to fund up to $10 million through this program, and we're looking to fund large, scalable programs that support the entire state or a region or more than one county. And when we say more than one county, this could be adjacent counties, or it could be that you are planning a pilot program and you want to choose 10 counties that are geographically dispersed, that are diverse across the state. So when we say more than one county, we truly just mean more than one county, but we are looking for large scale programs. The second part of this is that the eligible entities are universities, community colleges, and state agencies. And I'll talk through that eligibility in more detail in just a moment. But I did want you to know that coming up is another part of this grant program. It's phase 2, and that's the capacity building grant program. This will launch in winter 2023. We expect to fund about $14 million in that program. And this will be much more of a localized effort. So while this interagency program are big scalable programs, these we're funding at the local level to build capacity to develop or expand digital equity programs in communities across North Carolina. This grant program will likely require partnerships between local municipalities and community-based organizations. If you have questions about the capacity building grant program, I'm happy to answer those offline. But today we were focused on the Interagency Digital Equity Funding Program. So let's get into it then and move on to the next slide. And talk through eligibility and funding for this program. So in order to be eligible, applicants must be an entity of North Carolina state government, which includes all state government organizations as outlined on this webpage. You can find a link to this webpage on our website, as well as in the guidelines. If you have questions about whether you're eligible, I'm happy to answer those. You can also be a University of North Carolina system or individual school, university, or center within that system, or North Carolina Community College system or individual schools, colleges, or centers within that system. So those are who are eligible for this round. applicants can apply for up to $2 million. Now, I will say we expect to fund between 10 to 15 entities with this first 10 million. And so we cannot fund every applicant at $2 million. So we do reserve the right to kind of come back, have a conversation, and see if you might want to fund a portion of that application. I'll say we hope not to do too much of that. We want to be able to fund you at the amount that you've asked for. But because we're working within state government agencies, we do have a little bit more flexibility here to have more of a conversation after you've turned in an application, whether it's about funding or if it's about partnership. So it's possible we can do some matchmaking, right? We expect to be reading lots of different applications from different parts of state government that might have similar partners that might be doing similar work. And so it's possible we could come back to you, do some matchmaking, see what it would look like to partner on a project. We are seeing one application per office will be accepted. However, we will accept more than one application per agency or institution as long as they're a part of separate divisions or offices. So the example we've used in the guidelines is if the Department on Aging and the Office of Rural Health both want to apply, that's great. They're both a part of DHHS. But we would not accept two applications from the Office of Rural Health because they are one specific office. If you have questions, I know that this can get a little confusing if you're at a community college or at a university. I'm happy to talk with you specifically about your situation. The funding term for this grant is 2 years. The start date will be stipulated and outlined on the signed contract that should you be funded, you would sign with NCDIT. But we're expecting the funding term will be January 1, 2023 through December 31st, 2024. So let's move on to the next slide and talk through the priority populations for this grant. So projects who are funded must prioritize one or more of the following groups. So this is low-income households, so households that are at 150% of the federal poverty level or below, individuals who primarily reside in a rural area, aging residents, incarcerated individuals or second chance justice-involved individuals, veterans, individuals with disabilities, individuals who with a language barrier. So this includes individuals who are English language learners and or who have low levels of literacy, and individuals who are members of a racial or ethnic minority group. And I'll say these priority populations are not only the populations that have been traditionally the most digitally excluded populations in the state, but these are also the populations that we are prioritizing as a part of our year-long digital equity planning process that is about to kick off. So we will be working with these populations in various ways, and I think that's helpful for you as you apply. This is not, these are populations that we have a focus on and will be focused on for at least the next 5 to 6 years. So moving on to the next slide. I wanted to provide some examples of projects. So we at the Office of Digital Equity and Literacy don't want to be prescriptive, right? You may have some really imaginative, creative projects that you want to launch that you don't see here in these examples of projects. But I think it's helpful for people to see what kinds of projects we're looking to fund, especially because this is not an infrastructure grant. We're not actually funding the fiber in the ground or the build out of broadband infrastructure like the Broadband Infrastructure Office. We're funding other aspects to ensure that North Carolina is the most digitally is a fully digitally literate state. So examples of these projects include a digital navigator program to help community members get connected to the internet, use digital tools, access digital skills classes. So think of healthcare navigator, but someone who's focused on the digital needs of a community. This could be developing digital literacy and digital skills courses or trainings, It could be supporting local digital inclusion coalitions to develop or implement municipal or regional digital inclusion plans. These funds could be used to expand device lending programs or device distribution programs. I'll say if you're interested in focusing on device lending or distribution, having an aspect of connecting people to the wraparound services they need to use that device will be really important. So not just handing people a device and saying, see ya, but are you connecting them to local digital literacy classes, to a local digital navigator, those sorts of services. Increasing the accessibility or usability of online and digital content. These funds can be used towards staff time or consulting services. That's maybe the biggest question I've gotten is, can we hire someone to support the program that we're developing through these funds? And yes, you can hire people. You can also use these funds for telehealth services. So this could mean creating telehealth rooms in libraries, schools, or other community spaces, or other projects that are related to internet affordability, devices, digital literacy, and technical assistance or support. So these are ideas. We're not prescribing what these look like. If you have a question or you have an idea that you want to talk through, that's my job. So reach out to me. Let's talk through your idea. Let's see if it fits in with the eligibility criteria. So let's move on to the next slide and really talk through how you can apply, since it is a two-part process. So the application deadline is 5 p.m. on October 28th. So it's coming up. We know this was a fast turnaround. In order to apply, you must do two things. One, you must complete an online application form. This is a very basic form. It's asking for your name, your organization, some really basic information. And then you must also submit a complete application document, which includes the cover page, project narrative, timeline, and budget, formatted into a single PDF to me. So you must email that. So both of those things have to be done by 5 p.m. on October 28th. A complete application document, so that PDF that you'd be sending my way, should have 4 main parts. It should have a cover page. In the guidelines, it tells you specifically what should be on that cover page. I don't know that we need to focus on it today. It also should have a project narrative. This project narrative must not exceed 4 pages, single space, 12-point font. The cover page, timeline, and budget are not included in that project narrative. And in just a moment, I'm going to walk through each aspect of this project narrative, but there are 5 sections: scope of the project, area and population served, intended outcomes and metrics, partners and local engagement, and any potential obstacles. As a part of the application document, you must also provide a project timeline. So what are the main activities of your project and when will they be complete? We're especially interested in what can you accomplish in that first year. We really want to see some tangible results that are making transformational change for North Carolina communities for this grant. And we're interested in knowing what can you do in that first year. We also will need to see a project budget. We do have a project budget template that's a part of the guidelines that you can download. And we have Mark Swan on the call today from DIT, who is our budget and financial guru. So if you have questions about that, Mark is here to answer them today. And we're also available, of course, after this session over the next couple weeks to answer any of those budget questions. So let's move on to the next slide just to talk through that project narrative in a little bit more detail. So I will say being really clear in your project narrative, answering all of these bullet points really clearly is going to be important because that's part of how you're evaluated, is how you answer this section. This is the section that has the most information in it. So for the scope of the project, you'll provide a detailed description of all major project activities. You'll also describe in detail how this project will advance digital equity. You'll describe your entity's experience working in digital equity, if applicable. It's possible you have experience working in digital equity, you just haven't been calling it that. So thinking through, what have you done with this work in the past will be really important. If your entity does not have experience in digital equity, that's okay, but tell us how you're going to build that experience. Who are you reaching out to? How are you building that expertise internally on your team? And then describe your entity's staff capacity for this project. We know capacity is always the issue. And describe any positions you plan to hire to increase your capacity in order to accomplish this project. The second part of the project narrative is the area and population served. So what geographic area will your project serve? For many of you, this will be very simple. For those of you who maybe serve a statewide audience and you're choosing specific geographic areas, it might be more complex. You may not know yet specifically, but talking about as much as you can, what you do know, who you are planning to serve will be helpful. Who will your project serve? What are their biggest digital needs? This is where we're looking for some data in terms of what those populations' specific digital needs are. And then which priority populations outlined above will your project serve? And what is your experience working with these populations? And if you don't have experience working with those populations, who are you bringing in to ensure that you have trust with those communities? So moving on to the next slide and talking through the final aspects of the project narrative, there's a section on intended outcomes and metrics. So what are your outcomes and metrics for the project? How are you specifically defining success? What tangible activities will you accomplish that first year? We talked about that. We're asking for it in the timeline. We're asking for it in the project narrative. And then how will you share what you're learning outside your agency? And this is important because we want these projects to be scalable. We want to take these best practices and learn from them. I also mentioned we're launching a digital equity planning process. And as a part of that process, we have to identify promising best practices happening around the state and nationally that we may want to expand or implement as a part of the implementation phase of that digital equity plan. So hearing how you plan to share your best practices will be really important to us. Then we also want to know, who are you partnering with? So include a list of partners involved in the project and describe their roles. If all partners aren't identified yet, please identify your process for identifying partners. So who will you bring in order to make sure that your project is successful? And then finally, we know that there are going to be obstacles, right? Particularly when you talk about working with vulnerable populations. So discuss any barriers that you anticipate could happen and that you might encounter, and how will you go about addressing those barriers moving forward. So going to the final slide, this is where we're opening up to you for questions. All of this information and more can be found on our website, and I've put the web address there. You can always reach out to me. It's my job to answer your questions, to provide technical assistance on this. So please reach out to me if you do have questions. But I'd love to hear from the group. What questions does this group have? So remember, you can type in the chat if you have any specific questions about what I just outlined or the grant in general, or you can raise your hand to unmute yourself and we will call on you. And it can take just a moment. We'll have to request that you unmute yourself, and then you'll unmute yourself and then you can talk. So what questions do people have? Any questions from the group? Okay, it looks like Natalie Rivera has raised her hand. Go ahead, Natalie.
I just figured since no one else was asking,
Go ahead.
Here again this week. I was curious, and maybe you could point me in the right direction. Something that we've been thinking about is training folks on the ground on like a county level that wouldn't normally have that sort of digital inclusion one-on-one training, digital equity one-on-one, and kind of supporting folks to understanding more about digital equity, because a lot of it's a new topic for a lot of people. And then, I mean, we're looking at other ideas too around digital literacy, telemedicine. I have been trying to think of a term for this sort of trainee, and it's not really a digital navigator, because you're not at this moment in time, they're not like training other folks on technology, but it's kind of like a digital equity expert. I don't know, but I've been searching the web trying to find a term, and if it even makes sense to promote that. But yeah, any ideas?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a term for it. I think this is really important. It's definitely work that our office does. It's work that I did previously at NC State, and that the work that Institute for Emerging Issues does in terms of like just pure education. What is digital inclusion? What is digital equity? Why does it matter? It is a new term. You're absolutely right. Are you almost thinking of these as like, I'm trying to think of the right term too, but as kind of almost like digital inclusion champions within counties across the state? Is that what you're thinking, or is it
something like that? And to where, they're working with really directly with the population that we serve, being like ag workers, for example. And so having, champions or something, having them more knowledgeable would empower them to share and, make sure those folks are included in digital inclusion plans. Like, that's sort of where I'm going with it. I'm glad that you're understanding when I'm saying what that is, but that's the idea, to build capacity in that level, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it sounds interesting. Certainly. It also could help as we, consider the building capacity in local communities. If you have champions who are already on the ground talking to people about why this matters, making those connections, it helps lay the groundwork for when this other grant program comes down the line. There'll be other federal programs coming down the line as well to provide funding. So it's an interesting idea, Natalie.
Okay. Thanks, Maggie. That it's helpful to know what I'm talking about. Thanks.
I do. I absolutely know what you're talking about. I'm happy to be more of a sounding board on that too, if you have more questions. Who else? Who else has a question? It looks like Lisa Jane has raised her hand. Go ahead, Lisa.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the information, by the way. This is wonderful. I have a question about, is there a way to find out a certain area or by county their current digital footprint, like what's available in that county as it pertains to the services that we may be asking for, that type of thing? Is there like a statewide, resource that we could go to look at a county by county basis?
Yes. So there's a couple options for you. We do have something called the Broadband Access and Adoption Indices, which are on our website. And that has, the data's a little out of date. That's a challenge we have with a lot of this, but it can give you a snapshot. As there's an expert, national expert, who talks about how this data, they wouldn't use it to go to the moon, but they'd use it to plan to go to the moon. So it can be helpful in your planning purposes. There is also our North Carolina One Map, which has some really good basic data, a lot of infrastructure data. And then there's the American Communities Survey data as well. And this reminds me, we had a similar question last time. And so we need to get those links in the FAQs online. So we'll make sure that we do that. so that you have access to that. But most of the digital kind of equity, digital literacy data that we have comes from the American Community Surveys called ACS data, and that's through the U.S. Census.
Okay, great, thank you. That's very helpful.
And if you're not seeing those right away, it could be a couple-day lag to get that online. Feel free to send me an email, and I'll make sure that you're sent in the right direction.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Thanks, Lisa. Morgan had a question in the chat. If you currently have a digital equity program, can the funding be to continue that program as well as to grow the program beyond what it is to involve more populations and locations? Yes, it can be to continue the program, though, because we are looking for kind of scalable programs. Morgan, we'd like to see that it's maybe a continuation and an addition. So what are you learning from your current program that you could use to serve other counties, other schools, other parts of the state? What other questions? You're welcome. Does anyone else want to share what they're thinking about? It's okay if the question is kind of half-baked. We can talk it through. Well, while we wait to see if people have any other thoughts, Mark from my team, I'm going to just put you on the spot and see if there's anything that people should be thinking about as they put together their budget, anything that you think would be helpful based on the questions we've had so far. I'm putting you on the spot, I know.
So yeah, I didn't see the budget document we put out there is really, really simple. It's not meant to be, we didn't lock it down, none of that. I've done a lot of spreadsheets over time, and people try and lock them down, and it just makes it hard to use. It's meant to just be a simple way for you to sort of gather your thoughts and put it together. There is a salary tab just so you can think through that, and it helps calculate some of that. But if all you do is that front tab, that's fine. You can put it in pretty cleanly, and that puts it into the format where we can report it. The grayed out stuff at the top is stuff you don't need to worry about.
We did try to make it pretty simple for you, both for the budget and for the submitting the application itself.
And lots of people have asked in the prior iterations, we've had questions about what's allowable and that kind of thing. Generally, this is under the revenue replacement program, which means that you can basically follow your own budget rules, especially being state entities. You're already following good government, and so all you have to do is follow your own standard rules, and you're good to go. I think I saw a question that had to do with budget.
Yeah, we had a really good question last time around food, which can always be something that trips up budgets. But because this is revenue replacement, food is an eligible expense, but you have to just follow the guidelines in your university or agency. So checking with them before you add in a big food line item. And I do see Morgan asked, are you able to include wraparound services in the budget? Morgan, can you give us a little bit more information? You're welcome to raise your hand so we can unmute you. Yes, all right, we'll get you unmuted. Go ahead.
Thinking about food for one, but also transportation. that sort of thing. Just the things that might be needed to just make sure that we are making the program as equitable as possible, and particularly when we're talking about some of the rural areas, and if it's bringing people together, then transportation might be necessary and that sort of thing. I just didn't know if there was anything that might be left out of that budget conversation, so then we could be looking for alternative funding if we needed to add to.
So I understand it is challenging to do those things in state government. But I will tell you that this grant, the grants we got from the federal government, ARPA, very much encourages that kind of thing.
Okay, great.
So it is a plus. And now I know you'll have to work with your business folks to try and get through the state process. But yes, absolutely, you can use those. I think the only thing we've come up with that's just, well, there's some others, but obviously, we can't pay for alcohol with the grant. There's other standards of, you can't sue the federal government with the grant, that kind of thing.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. What other questions? All right, can you see your hand raised? We'll get you unmuted. Go ahead.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. So one of our strategies is to provide some digital literacy and digital skills training in the cooperative extension through the cooperative extension system. If we want to put together a mobile digital literacy classroom, meaning, I don't know, 5 or 10 laptops that we can go out and do training with. In this grant, would it be better to purchase that or lease those?
I don't know that I have a leg to stand on, but I believe purchasing is the way to go.
Okay.
We believe that at the end of this grant, we will need to request property disposal instructions. We believe that in most cases, we will be able to make those available to stay where they're at. I can't obviously promise that.
Okay. Because I'm thinking if we get to the end of that, and ideally when we could continue that, find funding to continue that. But if we can't, we know a few agencies like in Charlotte and Durham that would love to have those devices to be able to give out. But anyway, that was one of the things I was wondering about, the purchase or lease.
Yeah, and I think the federal government won't be a problem. I think maybe the state rules will have to make sure that we run those through well, but I think making strong business case is the way to go.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Kenny. And then we got a question from Lisa. Are giveaways allowable? For example, for students in an after-school program, giving them T-shirts, for example. Mark, do you have a sense on that?
So I would lean on the state rules. That's where we have the most wrinkle. I think that would be okay within reason. Again, the costs have to be reasonable, and you want to make a business case for it. So if there was a clear advertising component of that, I think that could be allowable. The federal government has rolled this program out fairly quickly, and so everything's not spelled out perfectly. So it very much falls back on the reasonableness standard. Make a solid business case and say, hey, look, we're going to put this web address on these shirts, or maybe it's something simpler, a QR code or something. There's ways that it gets your message out there better than you could otherwise, and I think that is a good case to make for that.
So it really does sound like these funds are flexible, but you have to make sure that your university, college, state agency is on board with how you're spending them as well. And you're following those guidelines.
It's worth noting that, everyone involved in this grant wants very much for it to do good in the community. And so the more you can point to that in your logic, I think the better off you are.
Any other questions? There are 21 of you still on. Yes, Alicia Bryce just raised her hand. We'll get you unmuted, Alicia. Go ahead. Alicia, are you there? We are not hearing you for some reason. So it may be better to type in the chat. Sorry about that. While we get Alicia sorted out, is there any other questions? Alicia, we cannot hear you. So maybe best to type your question in the chat. Thanks, Carolina. While we wait for Alicia to type in the chat, I just wanted to know oh, here she goes. She's going to email her question. All right. Thank you, Alicia. I will say that if you have any questions about the eligibility of your program, please reach out. We've had a number of folks reach out whose projects are very infrastructure focused. So building out, fiber to a housing authority, or working on permits for broadband infrastructure build out. And that's really not the spirit of this grant. That's something that our sister office, the Broadband Infrastructure Office, will be really focused on. And so we're always happy to put you in touch with the work that they're doing, and there is lots of funding coming down. But if you have a question about whether this is infrastructure focused or digital equity focused, please reach out, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you about that. Because as was noted earlier, digital equity is kind of a new term. We've talked about the digital divide for decades, but it hasn't always been clear to people the way that digital equity intersects with access to broadband infrastructure. So if you have a question on your project, let us know. All right, I'm going to ask for one last call. Are there any other questions, thoughts, comments, half-baked ideas that you just want to talk through right now while you have the moment? Okay, Alicia Jack has raised her hand. Alicia, we're working to get you unmuted. You can go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so our area is quite mountainous. So we often use hotspots, but there are some issues with using hotspots. Would you fund something like Starlink?
So That's a good question. I think we would see Starlink still as an infrastructure. I think that that's interesting. Are you asking if we would pay for the subscription to use Starlink, or the kind of is Starlink in your area? I know that there's been some pilots.
Yes, it's starting to come in.
Okay, so I would say we would definitely consider funding, paying for households to, if Starlink is their internet service provider for the region that you're serving, then paying Starlink so that households can have internet access would be an eligible use. It would just be like, paying AT&T or any number of other internet service providers for internet. So yes, that would definitely be an eligible expense.
Okay, thank you.
You are welcome. It's a really good question. And we understand the challenges of hotspots. And Alicia, I think you and I have had some emails back and forth in my previous role about some of the challenges of hotspots. So these are some great questions. Any other questions today? Natalie, I see you have a question. We'll get you unmuted.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and just following up with that one, I know we've talked about it before, and I have definitely edited my narrative to explain a little bit better. Something that we're doing now and plan to continue to do is inclusion in a way where you're collaborating with internet service providers for broadband, like rate recipients. So we're not funding anything. We're just collaborating in a way to show where, like, for example, farms are located, migrant housing is located, like that sort of strategic part of the inclusion, while also working to do some reimbursements for things like the routers and the service fees to like get it started. So I've tried to explain it in that way so it's not an infrastructure thing. But is that sounding better to you than?
Yeah, that's not infrastructure. So that makes sense.
Okay, thank you for that affirmation.
You're welcome. And it is confusing, right? Like, what is infrastructure, what isn't? But paying for a subscription service is not infrastructure. Any last questions? Well, I really appreciate all of your time. I know you are very busy people. And so to spend an afternoon on a Monday with us, we really appreciate it. Please reach out to me if you have other questions. If you're anything like me, you get off the webinar and you say, oh gosh, I just thought of the perfect question. So send me an email. Again, I'm always happy to jump on a call or Teams and talk through your idea. So thank you so much. There is one more info session coming up on October 20th. You are welcome to join that or share that with colleagues to join. We appreciate your partnership and look forward to reading your applications. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.